I wonder if they looked like this, or any of these people. Now, my guess is probably not. How many of those families, that you created in your mind of ELT materials represent even your own family? Why is it that even when we're looking at these ELT materials, these families, we just sort of gloss over the fact that they don't even match our own family in some ways, let alone more families that our students might have around them, as well as, just generally in the places that you teach. So, of course, I'm not suggesting that this family doesn't exist. Of course it exists. But there are a wide variety of other families, and this should not be the representative of a family. Not to mention the fact that this family is super happy and quite attractive and limited narrative options, in my opinion. Now, here's an example of two families that probably don't appear in course books very often. The one on the left, we can see they're in a situation, I think, that many relationships experience at some point or other. You can see there's definitely some sort of relationship issue happening. And the one on the right also are in a situation that many families probably experience, where they're trying to get ready in the morning, and things are just not happening too well in the morning. Now, in both of these cases, I think they're both valuable to include in our ELT materials as examples of a variety of different groups of people that are in our societies and should be represented. Simply the fact that they're including Black people is not itself beyond a usualization approach. However, if I look at the left couple here, I would argue that this couple is experiencing something or displaying something that happens to all sorts of couples. There's nothing specific about that situation that is because they're marginalized, typically. They're just having a fight of some sort, right? The couple on the right, on the other hand, I think we can argue that their experiences of society, being two dads of two daughters, is going to be something that is a marginalized experience. It's something that they will experience differently than that straight white couple we saw earlier. So when we're going to include a marginalized group in a way that complements a usualization approach, there's a difference between simply including Black people for the sake of variety and authenticity, and then including an underrepresented group of people because their experiences are going to be different. So when we include marginalized experiences, because they're marginalized due to whatever the status quo situation is, I call this a sort of more disruptive approach, because I don't have a better name for it, because it's just on the scale of disruption. It's more disruptive than, say, a usualization approach is. And in order to simplify what that means, I broke it down into sort of 5 steps for how we can include these experiences. The first is to identify a status quo situation that marginalizes or oppresses a certain group of people in some way. So in other words, we want to choose the theme for a lesson because it is something the learners experience in their daily lives and is generally accepted as the common belief or behavior, but it demonstrates a social inequity to one or more specific groups of people who are not the dominant power group. A second step then is to And so what I mean is to then situate this social norm that we've chosen for learners through the visuals, the texts, which are audio or written, and some critical questions. And so this provides a baseline for all learners to comment on their experiences of this social norm that we've chosen to identify. Teachers can then diagnose whether or not the learners have noticed this social norm in their lives. And so to members of a majority group, it's often something unnoticed or accepted as the status quo, and that will become clear as you discuss it with some learners. Asking learners critical questions here may facilitate an awareness and get learners thinking about how they experience this social norm. So this can begin raising learner awareness about the inequities of this social norm. And for learners who experience the inequities of the social norm, they're going to be nodding along going, you know what, I totally get this. I experience this and I identify with this situation. Now, I don't think the point here is to then spotlight those learners and make them represent their experiences unless they want to. But what we're getting at is we're realizing amongst our learners how many of them sort of just accept these for the way it is and how many of them don't. And that can provide a baseline for going forward. The third step of creating a more disruptive approach lesson then is to then include the experiences of marginalized people. So we'll hear or read about these marginalized individuals' experiences of this social norm, because that will then provide some insight to everybody about how that social norm marginalizes that group of people. So these narratives don't fit a usualization approach because we're intentionally drawing attention to the specific experiences of being marginalized. These experiences demonstrate how the social norm impacts marginalized individuals differently compared to the majority group. And it's important here for the materials writers to take good care in how they set up this narrative so that it doesn't make the marginalized group people seem strange or their experiences absurd, but as reasonable and human. The purpose here is to help some learners see their identities accurately reflected, valued, and worth being included in a discussion topic and the materials so that they can get the language as well, practice language to talk about themselves. And for the other learners who don't identify with these marginalized experiences, it gives them the space to see perspectives different to their own, and potentially and hopefully build some empathy for different people and potentially consider new ways of looking at that social norm. A fourth component then is to build this connection. So we want to build personal connections to the problems that are caused by the social norms so that people who identify as marginalized and experience the inequities of the social norm, they have a connection to that. But the learners who don't identify as marginalized in this particular situation also will have a connection to the social norm and how it is important in their lives. So, I mean, ultimately, if we want all learners to critically evaluate this social norm, they first have to care about it. So the most effective way to do this is to help learners build connections between others and themselves. And we can create questions and activities that encourage learners to notice these connections. By doing so, we can build empathy for others' experiences, and that's because we can identify with them through this connection. This helps everyone start to understand that the social norm is not the way things have to be. That it's not ideal for you, it's not ideal for me, it's not ideal for anyone except those people who have the power and want to continue having that power at the expense of other people. Then finally, the last sort of culminating step of this lesson plan would be then to improve the situation through an activity or a lesson. So ultimately, disruptive materials aim to level out everyone's experiences in terms of awareness, values, and understanding. Disruptive materials involve the learners in discussing how to improve the lives of all members of society, regardless of the difference, and not to simply accept what is currently considered normal and too difficult or inconvenient to change. So in other words, the status quo. Possibly to end off the lesson, disruptive materials can push the learners to collaboratively look forward and to empower them to make changes to this social norm. I mean, they're going to be doing so in their own languages as well as in English. And so giving them the sort of push towards this direction is something that as educators we have the affordance to do. Now, in your teacher's notes, you can encourage the teacher to point out that learning a new language and effectively communicating in it may have seemed impossible to the learners once too. So making changes to the status quo can now seem a little bit more realistic than it may have before. So all of that, I hope sounds like it makes sense. There are these 5 steps to create a disruptive approach lesson, and maybe it would be helpful to see a couple of examples. So I recently finished this book called How to Write Inclusive Materials, and the timing was just coincidental that it came out just before IATEFL happened. And honestly, it was not planned that way, because I should have been able to get this book done a little bit earlier than that, but pandemic. So what I'm going to show you is a couple of example lessons, or at least an insight to a couple of example lessons from this book that demonstrate this disruptive approach. One is for a lower level class, because I want to show that this is possible in an intermediate or a slightly below intermediate class, as well as a higher level class. And so the first lesson has a target language of family relationships, at-home activities, progressive verbs, right, that type of thing. And the social norm that we've identified for this lesson is what is a family, an expectation about what families are. But a kind of secondary one is the expectation about learning materials and what the content of learning materials are versus the reality of life itself. So those are kind of 2 social norms that are going to come out in this lesson. And then I'm going to show you a quick higher level lesson as well, where we have a little bit more language at our disposal. And the target language in this case will be problem solution. The social norm that I've identified that marginalizes people is public washrooms. And not only that, but other sort of binary choices.